Hello. Today I want to talk some more about God realization and about my Guru for God who teaches about God realization. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi is my Guru for God. He teaches about God as he teaches about meditation. This is part 3 of Who is Guru for God. Maharishi's first teaching about God is that universal, impersonal God is realized in the transcendent. When you have a meditation practice that transcends the relative field, then the experience is of universal God, of divine being, in the transcendent. This is the first realization of God, the experience of universal God when the relative field is transcended in your meditation practice. Now, the relative field is the created world that we live in, and it is manifest with phenomenal forms that come and go, ever changing, and it is bounded by space, time, and causation, and it is eternal. It is the world that we live in and the infinities of universes that there are. But when you transcend the relative field, then you are left by yourself, itself alone by itself, revealing itself to itself. The self is the transcendent. It is the fullness of divine being, of universal God. And that is the first God realization, when you transcend the relative field in your meditation practice. Universal God is the field of the absolute, that is never changing. And it's unmanifest, it's unbounded, it's unlimited wholeness and fullness. And that is universal God. Now in time, when you have a regular meditation practice and you transcend repeatedly, your mind and your physiology are so transformed by that experience of the fullness, the wholeness of universal God, that they rise to that status of the self. They rise to that status of divine being. Then you are established in yourself, and no experience here in the relative field can shake that. So now you hold 2 states of consciousness simultaneously. You hold the consciousness of divine being, of universal God, at the same time as you hold consciousness of the relative field, waking, dreaming, or sleeping. You hold 2 states of consciousness simultaneously. And with that consciousness of universal God, you live God here in the world as you go about your life. Now that God realization is permanent, you are permanently in union with universal God. Your heart and your mind are so infused with that fullness and wholeness that now you are capable of realizing your personal God here in the relative field, whereas universal impersonal God is realized in the transcendent. Your personal God is realized here in the relative field. Your personal God might be Krishna or Christ or Buddha or Maharishi or any fully realized human being. And your personal God is realized here in the world, first on the level of your feelings of love and devotion for them, then on the level of your thinking, and finally on the level of your senses. All of your senses perceive the glory of your personal God manifest here in the world. Now your two states of consciousness are the consciousness of self alongside the consciousness of the finest celestial relative values, because those celestial relative values are your perceptions of your personal God made manifest here in the world. Now you are in God consciousness, and this is the second realization of God, the realization of your personal God, and that realization is here in the relative field. But the realization of God continues to develop. Maharishi teaches next about the realization of Brahman, the knowing of Brahman. Brahman is the Lord of Lords. They hold that fullness, that wholeness of the relative field and the absolute field together within them. They connect that gulf between the relative and the absolute. Brahman presides over both eternal fields of absolute and relative. Brahman is totality. When you have developed your consciousness to God consciousness, in time, God consciousness changes to Brahmi Chaitana, or consciousness of Brahm, unity consciousness. Whereas in the first stage of enlightenment, when you are established in yourself, there is duality of self and the relative field. In the realization of your personal God, there is still duality. There's the consciousness of self and the consciousness of the finest relative values. But when personal God and self dissolve into Brahm, then there is only one consciousness of Brahm, of unity, of totality and wholeness, of the fullness of the absolute and the relative held together within Brahm. The fullness of your devotion and your love and your perceptions of your personal God come to find their dissolution in Brahm. You see all beings, the entire relative field of creation within the self. Those finest celestial impulses are so fine, you realize that it is nothing but the self. So now the entire relative field is seen within the self, and then the self is seen within Brahm. So there is the dissolution of the self, the dissolution of your personal God into the wholeness, the fullness of Brahm. Now you know Brahm, and anyone who knows Brahm is no longer anyone. The knower of Brahm is Brahm. So this is the final God realization, rising to that value of Brahmi Chaitana, the consciousness of Brahm, where there is one consciousness alone. Totality, wholeness, fullness. Brahm that holds both the relative and the absolute within. Thank you, beloved Guru. All glory be to thee.